Here's what they never told you in Sunday school. When Jesus talked about debt forgiveness, he wasn't being poetic. He was talking about actual debt. The kind that could take your land, enslave your family, and erase your future in a single bad harvest. The world he lived in wasn't some peaceful spiritual setting. It was an extraction machine, and most people living in it were being crushed. Let me show you how the economy actually worked in first century Judea. Because once you understand the financial system Jesus was born into, everything he said stops sounding like philosophy and starts sounding like economic warfare. First century Judea sat inside the Roman Empire, the most efficient wealth extraction system the ancient world had ever built. Rome didn't conquer territories to help them develop, it conquered them to fund the center. Everything flowed one direction, outward from the provinces, inward to Rome. Grain, silver, labor, tribute. Judea was rural, agricultural, and poor. Most families survived on small plots of land, just enough to eat if the weather cooperated. There were no safety nets, no insurance, no bailouts. A bad harvest didn't mean lower income, it meant starvation. And Rome didn't care. Rome governed through local elites, kings like Herod who ruled with imperial approval, and later Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate. Their job wasn't to improve people's lives, it was to maintain order and ensure the money kept flowing. Taxes were the backbone of this system. And here's what's critical to understand. These weren't taxes on profit or income, they were taxes on existence. You paid because you were alive. Land tax, produce tax, head tax, a flat fee just for being a person, toll taxes on roads and markets, and on top of all that, religious taxes owed to the temple. Miss a payment? There was no appeals process, no IRS helpline. Tax collection was outsourced to private contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome up front for the right to collect, then squeezed the population to recover their costs and turn a profit. Abuse wasn't a bug, it was the business model. If you couldn't pay your taxes, you borrowed. Debt was everywhere, and it had no escape hatches. No bankruptcy protection, no debt restructuring, no statute of limitations. Interest accumulated fast. Land was collateral. Here's how the cycle worked. A farmer plants his crops, the weather turns, the harvest fails. Taxes are still due. He borrows from a wealthy landowner or a temple-connected elite at high interest. Next year, the crop barely recovers, but the debt remains. Eventually, the land gets seized. The farmer becomes a tenant on what used to be his own property. Or worse, a day laborer. Or he just disappears. This wasn't random misfortune, it was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. Large estates replaced small family plots. Wealth clustered around elites connected to Roman authority and temple administration. The majority sank into precarity. There was no safety net. If you lost your land, there was no unemployment support, no welfare, no public housing. Your family was your only buffer. Community charity existed, but it couldn't absorb systemic collapse. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing your land meant losing your status, your security, your identity. One bad season could destroy your family's future for generations. This is the world Jesus was born into. And I need to say this clearly. Most people weren't poor because they were lazy or immoral or cursed by God. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rents. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure landed on the people with the least margin for error, and it produced something dangerous: rage. Judea wasn't peaceful, it was a powder keg. Rebellions flared constantly. Banditry wasn't just crime, It was economic desperation. Messianic movements emerged promising justice, reversal, and relief. These movements didn't grow out of comfort, they grew out of collapse. And this is where modern people completely miss the point. When crowds listened to Jesus talk about debt forgiveness, they weren't hearing spiritual metaphors, they were hearing economic survival. When he talked about the poor, it wasn't abstract charity, it was their neighbors, their families, themselves. Forgiveness didn't just mean emotional healing, it meant debt cancellation, reset, escape. Words weren't just words, they were weapons. Because in a system this tight, even small shifts feel revolutionary. Even ideas destabilize power. Now let's talk about the institution everyone believed was supposed to protect them: the temple. Most people think of the Jerusalem temple as a place of worship, and it was, but it was also one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. The temple didn't just shape belief, it moved money. Every adult Jewish male owed a yearly temple tax. This wasn't optional, it was enforced. The tax had to be paid in a specific coin, the Tyrian shekel, because of its consistent silver content. Roman coins weren't accepted, local currency wasn't accepted. That meant people had to exchange their money to fulfill their religious obligation. Money changers handled the exchange. They didn't do it for free. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals had to convert currency. Vendors sold animals for sacrifice, doves, lambs, cattle, at temple-approved prices. If you were poor, you still paid, maybe in smaller offerings, but you paid. Religion wasn't replacing the Roman tax burden, it was stacked on top of it. Here's the critical tension. The temple elite were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. High priests weren't chosen by spiritual merit, they were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. So the institution claiming moral authority over the people also benefited from the same extraction logic that impoverished them. The temple preached holiness and forgiveness, but its operations reinforced debt, inequality, and exclusion. Access to God required payment. Purity required offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifice. Sacrifice required money. If you had none, you relied on charity. But charity was inconsistent. It couldn't undo land loss. It couldn't cancel debts. It treated symptoms, not roots. And people noticed. By the 1st century, resentment towards temple authorities was widespread, not because people rejected faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and the people looked increasingly like another arm of elite control. This is the context Jesus operated in. He didn't attack Rome directly. That would have ended quickly. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed value. He challenged who deserved authority and why. Economic language appears everywhere in his teachings. Debt, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, masters, servants. These weren't random metaphors, they reflected daily life. They made inequality visible. And then came the act that sealed his fate, the disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it wasn't just religious outrage, it was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer, he was attacking the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. He called it a den of robbers, not because money existed, but because extraction had replaced justice. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated prophets, it tolerated preachers, it even tolerated critics. What it didn't tolerate was instability. Temple authorities knew that unrest during Passover, when Jerusalem filled with pilgrims, was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance equaled rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't just preaching, he was disrupting flows, challenging legitimacy, destabilizing the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. The conflict wasn't primarily theological, It was economic and political. The system could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. What it couldn't tolerate was a narrative that made people question why the suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Within a generation, Judea exploded. In 66 CE, full-scale revolt broke out. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish life, was destroyed stone by stone. Hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced. Rome didn't just suppress dissent, it dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible, and then it rebuilt control on its own terms. Here's what people miss. The destruction of the temple didn't end economic extraction, it streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. Debt didn't disappear. It became more bureaucratic, more absolute. In the short term, Rome won decisively. But winning territory isn't the same as winning meaning. Jesus hadn't led an army. He hadn't promised land redistribution. He wasn't trying to replace Roman administration. What he challenged was the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable, deserved, and divinely sanctioned. By undermining the idea that debt reflected moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional payment, by treating the poor as central rather than defective, he destabilized something Rome depended on just as much as legions: legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, Jesus' critique didn't vanish. Small communities formed that operated on different assumptions: shared resources, mutual aid, debt relief within the group, loyalty based on belief rather than land or status. These weren't revolutions, they were parallel logics, ways of living inside the empire without fully belonging to its moral economy. Rome crushed armed rebellion quickly, it always did, but this kind of challenge was harder to extinguish. It didn't require territory or treasuries, it moved with people, it survived loss, and over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully recovered control of the story people told themselves about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire didn't eliminate this alternative framework, it absorbed it. In doing so, it quietly conceded something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered, even to power. Here's what the economy of Jesus' time teaches us. Systems don't collapse just because they're unjust. They collapse when the narratives that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction, but it never fully repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel natural. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are extraordinarily durable. They survive hardship, they survive resentment, they even survive rebellion. What they don't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment when people stop accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with force, but with stories, it becomes much harder to believe those stories are accidental. If this changed how you see money, power, and history, subscribe to Modern Money Truths, because the system hasn't changed as much as you think, and once you learn the patterns, you can't unsee them.